Do you know what happens to a woman who dares to steal a ship from men? Not just steal it, but command it, bleed for it, and defy the empire that ruled the seas. History does not like to remember them. It prefers to turn them into legends or ghosts. But the truth, the real truth, is far darker. Because when the empire finally caught a woman who had tasted freedom on the open sea, it didn't just want to kill her. It wanted to erase the very idea of her. They called it unnatural. A woman aboard a ship was already bad luck. A woman giving orders to men, raising a cutlass, firing cannons, taking prizes that was a cosmic offense, against God, against man, against order itself. And yet, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called golden age of piracy, there were women who refused to stay on land. Women who slipped through the cracks of empire, traded corsets for cutlasses, and became outlaws of the sea. Anne Bonny, Mary Red, Mary Critchett, Fanny Campbell. Their names shimmer faintly in history's margins, like salt on old parchment. But their stories, the real ones, didn't end on the waves. They ended in the cold silence of courtrooms, in the crack of whips, in the choking air beneath gallows, and sometimes in the dark holds of rotting prison ships where no one recorded their names. The year was 1720. The Caribbean still smelled of gunpowder and sugar. The British Navy ruled the waves, and its greatest fear wasn't just the pirates who plundered gold, it was the ones who dared to mock the crown. And none mocked it more than a woman in breeches, smoking a pipe and laughing at the gallows. When Anne Bonny and Mary Read were captured near Jamaica that year, newspapers called them monsters in female form. Their existence shattered every code of civility that 18th century England believed in. A woman was supposed to be obedient, modest, silent. But these two had commanded ships, killed men, and fought in battle disguised as sailors. To the empire, they weren't just criminals. They were heretics. They were taken in chains to Spanish town, Jamaica, the humid capital of Britain's Caribbean authority. There, a hastily assembled naval tribunal awaited them. The Admiralty Court was not a place of justice, it was theatre. The accused stood in front of naval officers, merchants and clergy who all shared the same conviction. Women like this could not be allowed to exist. There was no jury, no appeal, no mercy. The courtroom was stifling that morning, thick with the scent of sweat and gun oil. The crowd pressed close as the judge read out the charges. Piracy upon the high seas, theft of His Majesty's vessels, robbery, and murder. The words rolled like cannon fire across the chamber. Mary Read stood first, broad-shouldered, her face calm, her posture defiant. When she was asked how she pleaded, she simply said, "Not guilty." Anne Bonny, red-haired and sharp-eyed, smiled faintly and repeated the same words. The spectators whispered. They had expected tears, begging. Instead, they saw composure. But the trial wasn't about evidence. It was about restoring order. The judge, a man who had never seen battle nor sea, declared them both guilty within hours. Pirates, he said, were the enemies of all mankind, but women who committed piracy were an abomination against nature. The sentence was death by hanging. When the verdict was delivered, Anne turned her gaze to the man sitting shackled nearby, her lover, the infamous Calico Jack Rackham, captain of the Revenge. His face was grey, drained of hope. Before they were taken away, Anne leaned toward him and said coldly, "If you had fought like a man, you would not have been hanged like a dog." It was a line that would echo across the centuries. The court transcripts from Spanish Town record one desperate plea from both women. They claimed to be pregnant. It was known in law as pleading the belly. If a condemned woman was carrying a child, execution would be postponed until after birth. Some were later executed, others died in childbirth, and some, very few, simply disappeared from the records. Mary Read's pregnancy bought her time, but she died of fever in prison before the rope could find her. Anne Bonny's fate remains uncertain. Some say her father, a wealthy planter, used his influence to free her. Others say she was quietly executed at dawn, her name crossed out of the register and buried beneath the tides of history. But Anne and Mary were the exceptions. For most women, there were no pleas, no pauses. By the mid-1700s, British Admiralty courts across the Caribbean, North America, and the West African coast had perfected the machinery of condemnation. Their trials were swift, their sentences absolute. The courtrooms themselves were makeshift, theaters of punishment erected in colonial ports. The accused stood on wooden planks slick with humidity, surrounded by clerks who wrote as though copying scripture. The prosecutor's words were always the same. These women have forsaken the natural order, and so the law of man and God alike shall forsake them. What did natural order mean in that world? It meant obedience. It meant silence. It meant staying on land while men claimed the sea. For a woman to live as a pirate was to expose the lie at the heart of empire. That power belonged to men by divine right. So the Admiralty did what all frightened powers do. It rewrote the story. The trial records describe these women as lewd, unnatural, possessed of manly courage. Even in condemning them, the judges couldn't help but marvel at their defiance. One court clerk in Jamaica wrote, "Their spirit is too strong for their sex. Their punishment must be made to fit their pride." That was the point of these trials, not just to punish but to perform control. Every sentence handed down against a female pirate was meant to send a message across the empire. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place. And so, before the rope ever touched their necks, they were already erased. The law stripped them of their names, their histories, their humanity. In the official ledgers, Bonny was no longer captain's mate or pirate. She became Bonny, spinster. Mary Red became Mary Red, of no fixed abode. Their stories were reduced to footnotes, their defiance rewritten as madness. But history, no matter how carefully edited, leaves fingerprints. Some witnesses in the Jamaican trial described Anne and Mary standing with their heads held high, refusing to weep. Others claimed they laughed as the verdict was read. One sailor, shaken by what he saw, wrote in a letter later discovered in the British archives, "If there be a hell, the judges will find fiercer women waiting there to judge them in turn." That was the true terror of these trials, not the executions, but the realization that even under the noose, these women could not be broken. By the end of the century, the age of piracy had ended. The seas were tamed, and the empire congratulated itself on restoring order. But buried in those same naval archives are the stories of the women who refused to kneel. They remind us that what the empire called unnatural was, in truth, the most natural thing of all, the human will to be free. Next came the rope, the whip, and the silence of the tide. But before we descend into those horrors, remember this. They were not hunted for gold. They were hunted for defiance. And that, in the eyes of empire, was the greatest crime of all. Do you know what it sounds like when an empire kills its outlaws? It isn't the crack of gunfire or the clash of swords. It's the creak of rope and the slow murmur of a rising tide. Because that's how the British Empire buried its pirates, not in the earth but in the water. The same ocean that gave them freedom became their grave. Execution Dock. The name alone could drain the blood from a man's face. It sat on the banks of the River Thames near Wapping, London, where the city met the sea. There, beneath the wooden gallows, the empire staged its final lesson to anyone who dared defy it. And when the condemned were women, the spectacle became something else entirely. A twisted theater of morality and gender, punishment and purity. Because to hang a woman wasn't just justice, it was correction. The morning light had a grey metallic tint that day. The air smelled of salt, soot and decay. Hundreds had gathered along the waterfront, pressing against the railings and rooftops to see what they had been promised. A woman pirate hanged by the tide. The prisoner's name was Mary Critchett. She wasn't a famous pirate like Bonny or Mary Read. She hadn't danced through legend or fought alongside captains. Her story was simpler and crueler. She had been a convict, transported from England to Virginia. But like so many others who had been shackled by empire, she saw her chance at freedom when a group of men seized a small vessel off the coast in 1729. She joined them, not as a captive, but as an equal. For a brief moment, she commanded the wind and the sea. It was enough to damn her. When the ship was recaptured, the men were hanged without hesitation. But Mary's presence on deck caused confusion. The court didn't know what to call her. sailor, criminal, monster. In the end, they settled on one word: unnatural. Her trial in Williamsburg lasted less than a day. There were no pleas of pregnancy, no influential family to intervene. The judges, naval men with powdered wigs and iron hearts, sentenced her to death under the Piracy Act of 1698. Her name was entered into the record once and then forgotten. When the cart rolled through London's narrow streets that morning, the crowd jeered and spat. The condemned stood in chains, flanked by soldiers. Some wept, others sang hymns or cursed. But Mary was silent. Her hair had been shorn short, her dress was torn and plain. She didn't look like a pirate queen. She looked like what she was, human. At Wapping, the procession stopped. The gallows loomed ahead, tall and dark against the pale sky. A priest muttered prayers. The tide was low, the river mud glistening black. The executioner didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. The ritual was older than both of them. A short drop. That's all they gave her. Enough for air to escape her lungs, but not enough for mercy. The body convulsed, twisting, trembling, a grotesque dance known as the Marshal's Dance. The crowd watched. Some cheered, some turned away. When it was over, the executioner stepped back, leaving her body hanging low over the river. By law, pirates were to remain at execution dock until 3 tides had washed over them. The Thames would rise and fall, until even the water had done its part to erase the crime. 3 tides, 3 chances for the river to take her back. The Empire called it justice. But it wasn't justice, it was spectacle. Public executions were the Empire's theater of control. They didn't just kill bodies, they killed the idea of rebellion. And women pirates were perfect for that stage. Their very existence defied everything polite society believed about womanhood: obedience, virtue, silence. So when the noose tightened, the crowd wasn't just watching a criminal die, they were watching a myth burn. To the Empire, the lesson was clear. This is what happens to women who forget their place. But sometimes, even in death, those women refused to play their roles. Witnesses at execution dock told stories, whispers really, about condemned women who faced the rope without fear. One was said to have laughed as the noose was placed around her neck. Another cursed the judge by name, vowing that his daughters would die in childbirth. They say the crowd fell silent when she spoke. Even the soldiers looked away. And when the tide finally rose, washing over her bare feet, someone in the crowd murmured that the sea was taking back its own. Yet not every woman was granted the dignity of death by rope. For many, the Empire had crueler ways. Before the gallows, there was the whip. Flogging was as common in naval justice as the tides themselves, but for women it carried a deeper cruelty. It wasn't just punishment, it was humiliation. It was meant to strip them not only of their skin, but of their identity. The cat-o'-nine-tails was a weapon designed for spectacle. 9 leather cords, each tipped with knots or metal hooks. Every lash tore open the flesh. The sound was unmistakable, a wet, cracking rhythm that drew crowds like a macabre song. In colonial ports from Kingston to Port Royal, flogging was a public event. People came to watch, to moralize, to feel safer in their obedience. When the condemned was a woman, the crowd grew twice as large. She would be tied to a post, her back bared. The executioner raised the whip high, and each strike echoed off the wooden docks. Some fainted, some cheered, some went home to write sermons about the wages of sin. It wasn't justice, it was domination dressed as law. The cruelty didn't stop there. Those not deemed worthy of execution were sometimes condemned to something worse: erasure. The Empire was pragmatic when it came to punishment. A dead pirate was a warning, but a broken one could be useful. Some women were sold into servitude, becoming concubines or household slaves in colonial settlements. Others vanished into prison ships, decommissioned war vessels turned into floating dungeons. The HMS Jersey, anchored in the New York harbor, became infamous for its inhuman conditions. Hundreds died aboard it, men and women both, chained in the darkness below deck. The air was thick with disease, the water was black with rot. Those who survived longer envied the dead, and somewhere in that darkness, history tells us, there were women. Not all pirates, perhaps, but all defiant, all erased. When the tide finally turned against piracy, and the British Empire declared the seas safe, they didn't record the number of women who died at execution dock, or the number who were whipped, or the number who simply disappeared. They didn't need to. The silence itself was victory enough, because silence is the Empire's favorite kind of punishment. It's clean, it's final, it leaves no bodies to bury. But if you listen closely to the water lapping against the old Wapping docks, to the wind over Port Royal, you can almost hear them, the echoes of women who refused to drown quietly. They didn't die for gold, they died for freedom, and for an empire that ruled the world, that was the most unforgivable crime of all. There are some fates worse than death, and the British Empire reserved those for women who had already been erased from its mercy. Death, after all, could make a pirate into a martyr. But slow decay, degradation, disappearance, that erased not only the body but the story. And when it came to women, erasure was the most efficient punishment of all. The rope silenced their breath. But these other punishments, those that took days, months, or even years to consume, silenced their existence. Most people know the names of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. They're remembered because they spoke back, because their trials were recorded, because history loves a woman who dies dramatically. But the archives tell us there were dozens of others, nameless, faceless women who shared their defiance, yet never reached the gallows. Their stories ended not with the crack of a noose, but with a quieter sound. The tearing of flesh, the closing of a cell door, the clinking of shackles on a deck slick with salt. Before execution, many female pirates were softened, as the officials called it. The process was a blend of humiliation, exhaustion, and cruelty, designed to break them down before the spectacle of death could begin. Some were starved, some were stripped and flogged, some were subjected to interrogations that bordered on torture, with the goal of wringing out confessions or names of fellow conspirators. To the Empire, it wasn't enough to destroy their bodies. They had to destroy the idea that a woman could ever command a ship again. Public flogging was among the oldest of these torments, and the most theatrical. It was not a private punishment, not hidden behind prison walls or within the confines of a courtroom. It was performed under the sun, in front of a crowd that came hungry for blood. The woman condemned would be tied to a wooden post at the docks, her wrists lashed above her head until the skin bruised purple. Her clothes would be cut open at the back, not only to expose the flesh, but to expose her shame. The whip, usually a cat-o'-nine-tails, was no ordinary weapon. Its 9 leather cords were weighted with lead or knotted with iron. Each strike tore through the skin and left trails that festered in the heat. The first lash drew gasps from the crowd. The 10th turned gasps into silence. By the 40th, the body was shaking uncontrollably, muscles spasming under the strain, the breath coming in desperate, uneven bursts. Flogging wasn't punishment, it was a lesson, and the lesson was meant for the audience as much as for the condemned. It told every woman watching, this is what happens when you take a man's place at sea. This is what happens when you dare to rule, to command, to fight. There are accounts half buried in colonial archives of women flogged in places like Port Royal, Kingston, Nassau, and Charleston. Some were accused pirates, some were smugglers or sailors who disguised themselves as men. Others were wives or lovers of pirates, punished not for what they did, but for who they loved. In 1726, a woman named Sarah Spencer was dragged through the streets of Kingston and flogged publicly for aiding and abetting pirates. The record says she suffered without sound or plea. She was never seen again. When women endured these punishments in silence, the Empire called it repentance. But historians know better. Silence is often the only defense of the powerless. It's the only weapon left when every other has been taken away. For others, the punishment wasn't the lash, it was life, or something that resembled it. When British governors decided to spare a woman from the gallows, it wasn't mercy. It was commerce. Female captives could be traded, sold, or gifted to officials and merchants as property. In the Caribbean and West African ports, captured women aboard pirate vessels were sometimes classified not as criminals, but as spoils of war. And spoils were profitable. In Spanish territories like Cartagena and Portobelo, women seized from pirate ships were often sent directly to slave markets. Those who were white or European might be kept as household servants or concubines by colonial officers. Those of African or indigenous descent were absorbed into plantation labor, their identities erased under the same ink that recorded them as miscellaneous cargo. Their captors rarely distinguished between pirates, sailors, or prisoners. To them, a woman on a ship was already guilty of defiance, of immorality, of transgression, and so she was punished accordingly. These women disappeared quietly into history's blind spots. They left no last words, no gallows speeches, no recorded deaths. They became shadows behind the spectacle of male violence. Their stories were consumed by salt and silence, but some fragments remain. In a Portuguese record from 1708, there is mention of a mulata mulher pirata captured near the Cape Verde Islands, sold in Bahia for 30 cruzados. No name, no age, no fate, just a transaction. In another archive from Havana, a note describes 2 English women found aboard a French privateer, delivered into the custody of Governor Orellana for disposal. What that meant, no one wrote down. The British Empire prided itself on order and record-keeping, yet its documents tell us most about what it chose to forget. The lives of these women became bureaucratic ghosts, entries without stories, names without bodies. And then there were those who were not sold or executed, but kept alive in another kind of hell, the prison hulks. Imagine the stench before anything else, the rot of seaweed, sewage, and sickness, all thick in the same stagnant air. These were decommissioned warships, their masts stripped bare, anchored in harbors like Plymouth, Portsmouth, and Kingston. They floated as prisons for those awaiting trial, transportation, or execution. Inside, the air was heavy with damp and disease. The prisoners were chained in rows below deck, barely enough space to turn. The heat was suffocating by day and freezing by night. Water dripped from the planks above. Rats crawled freely over sleeping bodies. Food was scarce and foul. Hardtack infested with maggots, thin gruel that barely passed for nourishment. And among the hundreds of men, there were women. No separate quarters, no protection, no records. Some were pirates, some were smugglers. Some were simply in the wrong place when the Empire decided to make an example. They were kept there for weeks, sometimes months, until disease claimed them or their minds gave way to madness. When they died, their bodies were wrapped in canvas and thrown overboard under cover of darkness. No funeral, no marker, just a ripple across the black water. Contemporary reports describe the death rate on these ships as excessive. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox spread rapidly. For women, there was the added horror of exploitation. Guards and sailors often preyed on them, confident that no one would ever record their crimes. And they were right. History did not record them. What makes this chapter of history so haunting isn't just the brutality, it's the absence, the deliberate silence. These women didn't just die, they were unwritten. Their bodies became anonymous warnings, their stories lost to a system that measured worth in obedience and silence. The British Empire liked to claim that it had conquered the seas, but the truth is, the sea was the one place it never fully understood, because the sea kept secrets. It swallowed the ships, the bones, the names. It refused to preserve the Empire's version of order, and maybe somewhere beneath those grey waters, the ghosts of these women still drift bound not by chains, but by the memory of their defiance. They were called criminals, monsters, whores, witches, but perhaps the only crime they ever committed was daring to believe they could belong to the sea the way men did. By the time the tide rose and fell for the 1000th time over Execution Dock, the world had already forgotten their names. The gallows had done its work. The whips had done theirs, the ships rotted away, but the silence remained, because that's what empires do best. They don't just kill people, they kill memory. And somewhere in that silence, between the whip's echo and the tide's pull, history buried its women pirates, not because they were monsters, but because they had dared to be free. Do you know what the sea does to secrets? It doesn't keep them, it erases them. It rolls them under, grinds them against salt and silence until they're smooth as glass, unrecognizable, untellable. That's what happened to the women who once ruled her waves, the pirates whose laughter and rage once carried across open water. When the empire caught them, it didn't simply punish them, it erased them in every way the sea knows how. Not with a single strike, not with a single rope, but with disappearance. Slow, inevitable, like a tide pulling everything it touches into the dark. By the 18th century, the Admiralty had perfected the art of erasure. They didn't just execute rebellion, they managed it, catalogued it, buried it neatly inside paperwork and protocol. The women who had taken up arms, who had commanded ships, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with men in defiance of the law, those women were anomalies, embarrassments to the logic of empire. Their existence disrupted order itself, and so when captured, their ends were carefully rewritten. For many there was no gallows, no trial, no last words. They simply vanished. Records refer to them in half sentences, vague enough to smother truth. Disposed of at discretion, transported and sent south, delivered to authority. These phrases appear in British colonial archives, in faded ink, beside names that stop abruptly: Anne, Mary, Elizabeth, and sometimes only a woman. Transported was the empire's polite word for exile. It meant being chained and sent across the world to serve out your days in forced labor, in colonies where heat and distance made death easier to forget. Australia, Jamaica, Barbados. These were the places where Britain buried its unwanted. For men, transportation meant quarrying stone or cutting sugarcane until their bodies broke. For women, it was often worse. In New South Wales, there are fragmentary reports of female convicts of maritime association arriving aboard prison transports in the early 1700s. Their crime, piracy, smuggling, or association with known pirates. Their sentence, labor without reprieve. Some ended up in penal colonies breaking rock under the sun. Others were handed off to settlers as servants, concubines, or wives, their identities erased by distance and necessity. One account from 1728 mentions a woman of uncommon speech and manner calling herself Captain Anne, who refused all work and raved of ships. She disappeared from records within a year, and yet, in every account, something bleeds through, a detail too vivid to be invention. A defiant phrase shouted at a guard, a refusal to eat, a sudden escape attempt that ended with gunfire on the docks. They were not obedient ghosts. Even as the empire ground them down, they resisted in fragments in small unrecorded rebellions that history forgot. But the sea perhaps did not. But not all disappearances happened in far-off colonies. Some took place within sight of London's own grey shores. When the execution dock grew crowded and the prisons overflowed, women accused of piracy were sometimes quietly relocated to the hulks anchored off Deptford or Woolwich. Officially, they were awaiting transport. Unofficially, they were left to rot. Conditions on those ships were an atrocity masquerading as order. The air below deck was thick with the smell of urine, tar, and unwashed bodies. Chains scraped against planks as prisoners shifted in their sleep or in their fever dreams. The women kept there were rarely acknowledged in reports, but hints of their existence remain in the writings of naval surgeons and inspectors. Certain female delinquents, one noted in 1742, suffered greatly from the heat and stench, and several expired without confession. Expired. That was the word. Not died, not murdered, just expired, like candles in the dark. When they did die, the disposal was efficient. Their bodies were wrapped in coarse canvas weighed with stones and slid into the river under night. The Thames swallowed them as it had swallowed so many. The water closed without a sound. No burial, no name. Only the tide marking time as it moved in and out, washing over the place where empire turned defiance into silence. But the cruelest fate of all was not death, it was absorption. For every woman who was hanged or flogged, there were others who were taken, owned, and remade into something unrecognizable. Concubinage, servitude, slavery. Those words echo through colonial archives like an afterthought. Captured in the Caribbean, women who had sailed with pirates, especially women of African or indigenous descent, were often reclassified as property. Spanish officials called them spoils of war. French merchants listed them as commodities. British officers used a colder term, reclamation. as if the act of stripping a woman's freedom and name was somehow restoring order. One record from 1711 tells of a ship seized near Tortuga with 4 women aboard, of mixed extraction, claiming to have fought. Their captors sold them at Port Royal, each for less than the price of a barrel of rum. Another from 1733 describes a female prisoner of English tongue, given as a gift to a plantation overseer for his service in capturing a pirate brigantine. Her name, written in fragile ink, is Margaret Kay. No last name, no record after that. And so the empire achieved what execution alone could not: invisibility. To erase a woman from history, they didn't need to kill her. They only had to rename her. Once a pirate, now a servant. Once a captain, now a slave. Once free, now forgotten. But there were whispers even then of those who escaped. Sailors' taverns in Kingston and Havana carried stories of women who slipped away from plantations and took to the sea again, disguised once more in men's clothing, vanishing into the horizon. They were never verified, but they persisted. Rumor has its own kind of immortality, especially when it smells of salt and rebellion. By the late 1700s, the age of piracy was over, and with it, the women who had dared to live by the tide's laws instead of the empire's. Their names had been reduced to curiosities: Anne Bonny, Mary Red, perhaps Grace O'Malley before them. Legends now cleaned up for romantic retellings, but the others, the nameless ones, they became ghosts that haunted the empire's margins. Every few years the Thames still reveals them, literally. The mudflats near Wapping sometimes yield fragments of bone and iron, remnants of the gallows, pieces of the dock where the condemned once stood. The water remembers, even when the archives forget. And when the tide retreats, it leaves behind those pale bones smoothed by centuries, silent witnesses to the truth. Because the truth is this: no woman was ever truly pardoned for piracy. Mercy was a myth, justice a performance. The courts were never designed to understand them, only to destroy them. Their punishment was not meant to balance the scales of law, but to restore a wounded hierarchy, to remind every man watching that the sea, though vast, belonged only to him. And yet, in some twisted way, the empire failed, because even in erasure, the story of these women survived half buried in letters, legends, and whispers. They exist between the lines of history, in the forgotten logbooks of ships, in the myths sailors tell when the fog drifts low and the waves rise high. Some say on nights when the tide pulls back far enough, you can still hear them: the faint creak of a rope, the echo of a woman's voice carried on the wind, singing, not in mourning, but in defiance, the sound of those who refused to die quietly, the ghosts of the sea that refused to stay erased. They are not gone, they are what the tide returns.